There you are. So yeah, if you need books, just raise your hand, Lisa. And you're welcome. Lizzie, there you are. You're welcome. And same with pens. If you need a pen, just raise your hand to fill in the blanks in the book there, and we'll get a pen out to you. We're on page 10 in the book. So last week we spoke about God's creational intentions. We kind of zoomed out and we looked at, admittedly, very briefly, but what's the story that the Bible is telling? Specifically when it comes to our embodied existence. And we spoke about how God created us with bodies. And His intention for that was eternal life in those bodies. That's why the tree of life is there in the garden. So that was God's intention. Well, what happened to that intention? Well, we spoke about it. It got, our embodied existence got corrupted because of our sin. So now life in the body, as Paul says in Romans 8, we groan in the body. We have sickness, injury, deformities, and eventually our lives are cut short by death. And so the question then is, what's God going to do about that? And we saw from Romans 8, as just one of many passages we could go to, that God's plan is to redeem our bodies, to redeem bodily existence, to resurrect our bodies the same way He has resurrected Christ's body that Rex spoke about this morning. Now, what I want to do in this class is look at two explicit texts in the Old Testament where God makes His resurrection promise, where He promises that His plan to overcome death has always been to resurrect human beings from death, to resurrect them from the dead, bodily resurrection. And so that's what we'll do today, and we're going to start with Isaiah 26. So I asked you to open there. We're going to look at Isaiah 26, and we're going to look at this one in its whole context here. Isaiah 26:13 to verse 20, or to chapter 27, verse 1. Let's read it all the way through, and then we'll work through it just for a few minutes, and you can fill out those blanks in your book there as we kind of summarize the main points. But let's first read it all the way through. So Isaiah 26, starting in verse 13. O Yahweh our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us, but your name alone we bring to remembrance. They are dead. They will not live. They are shades. They will not rise. To that end you have visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. But you have increased the nation, O Yahweh. You have increased the nation. You are glorified. You have enlarged all the borders of the land. O Yahweh, in distress they sought you. They poured out a whispered prayer when your discipline was upon them. Like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in her pangs when she is near to giving birth, so were we because of you, O Yahweh. We were pregnant, we writhed, but we have given birth to wind. We have accomplished no deliverance in the earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. Your dead shall live. Their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. Come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the fury has passed by. For behold, Yahweh is coming out from His place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity. And the earth will disclose the blood shed on it, and will no more cover its slain. In that day, Yahweh with His hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and He will slay the dragon that is in the sea. Now, we'll work through this passage and summarize the main points so then we can see the context of God's resurrection promise here. So if you're filling out the blanks in your book there on page 10, here's the first summary of the first major point in verse 13. Pagans have ruled over God's people. Pagans have ruled over God's people. That's what Isaiah means in verse 13 when he says, O Yahweh our God, other lords besides you have ruled over us. He's talking here in context about the subjugation of Israel by pagan powers. And if you know the biblical story, and if you know anything about Christian history, when pagan powers rule over Christians, what is commonly the case for those Christians, or for those people of faith, those saints? Whenever God's people have been ruled over by pagan powers, what have those pagan powers typically done to the Lord's people who are standing up for God? Persecution, death. Yeah, that's going to come into play here later, as well as in our next text. But notice what verse 14 says. Notice in verse 14 that Isaiah promises their end will be death. Their end will be death. See that in verse 14? They are dead. They will not live. They are shades. They will not arise. To that end you have visited them with destruction and wiped out all remembrance of them. In other words, even as Isaiah laments that God's people are ruled over by pagans, he knows and is assured that is not going to be forever. The rulership of pagans over God's people is not a permanent characteristic of existence. The evil kingdoms of this world will die, will fall. And this is then in contrast to the blessing on God's people. Because then in verse 15, we're told that the fate of God's people is that they're going to increase and expand. God's people will increase and expand. And that's verse 15. In contrast to the pagan powers that will die, verse 15 says, but you have increased the nation. You've increased the nation. You are glorified. You have enlarged all the borders of the land. And let me just put this subpoint up here. This is all for God's glory. This is all for Him. It's for His glory. We just get to be a part of it. We get to be the recipients of that gift. Now you might be wondering, if you're reading from the ESV like I am, the ESV uses past tense verbs in verse 15, whereas I've used future tense here in my point. God's people will increase and expand. Whereas in the ESV in verse 15, there's those past tense verbs. And that's just because I'm interpreting verse 15, I'm going to use a fancy word here. I'm interpreting verse 15 as speaking proleptically, which all that means is it's speaking about a future event as if it has already occurred. And that's a common thing you'll find in Hebrew poetry, in the Psalms, the prophets. And the reason that they do that is because it's speaking about the assurance of God's promise. That, hey, God has promised this, but it's so assured, we can go ahead and talk about it as if it's already happened. And the reason that I'm interpreting verse 15 that way is because it's difficult to see anything in Isaiah's lifetime that would fit what verse 15 says, where the nation of Israel expands and the people are multiplied. Nothing, it's just hard to identify something in Isaiah's lifetime that would fit that description. And so I think what Isaiah is doing in verse 15 is he's talking about that future promise, which ties it to the future promise clearly a few verses later. And then let me put the last few points up here for Isaiah 26, and then I'll stop and see what questions or thoughts you have here. Notice, though, that in verse 15, even though we have this assurance that God's people will expand and be blessed, that time of blessing is going to come after a time of hardship. And that's the next point Isaiah makes then in verses 16 to 18. The righteous have endured hardship under God's judgment. The righteous have endured hardship under God's judgment. Notice verse 16. O Yahweh, in distress they sought you. They poured out a whispered prayer when your discipline was upon them. And then notice verse 17. Like a pregnant woman who writhes and cries out in her pangs when she is near to giving birth, so were we because of you, O Yahweh. And the idea being communicated here is that even though God's people do have that time of promise and blessing in their future, and it's assured, there is a period of hardship under God's discipline that they must go through first. And this pain, as you can see in verses 17 to 18, is metaphorically likened to a woman in childbirth, in the pains of childbirth. And what's important is the realization that this discipline brings to God's people. Did you catch what the realization is? In verse 18, this discipline from God helps His people to understand one very important truth. Look at verse 18. We were pregnant. We writhed under this discipline of God, but we have given birth to wind, nothingness. We have accomplished no deliverance in the earth, and the inhabitants of the world have not fallen. The point Isaiah is making is that this discipline from God helps His people to realize that the righteous cannot accomplish their own deliverance. In this context, specifically, the righteous are not able to accomplish deliverance from the evil rebels of the world that war against God and His people. The righteous can't deliver themselves from that. And that's when God makes this amazing promise in verse 19. So in verse 18, here's the realization we've come to. We cannot deliver ourselves, God. We were in pains of childbirth, but we gave birth to nothingness, just wind. And look what then God says in verse 19. Look at what He will do to deliver. Your dead shall live. Their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy. For your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead. And so in verse 19, we have this assurance from God and His prophet Isaiah that the righteous will be resurrected from death. This is part of how God will right the wrongs in His world. This is how God will ensure that those who died under the lordship of pagans, which is the opposite of how it should be, because if the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob really is the true God, then what on earth are His people doing subjugated by other gods and peoples? Either Yahweh is not that strong, or maybe He doesn't exist. And this is just all a lie here. So when God's people are being killed and they're dying under the lordship of pagans, that says something about God. At least it would appear to. But God's way of righting that wrong, His way of showing that no, these people who died really are my people, and they are going to get to experience the blessing of life and expansion that I planned for them, The way God's going to accomplish that is, I will raise them from the dead. And those pagans who thought they had power over my people will be shown to be absolutely powerless. That's the promise of Isaiah 19, verse 19. Isaiah 26, verse 19. And notice that this is bodily resurrection. Notice the description in verse 19. Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise, and then you who dwell in the dust of the earth, awake. Notice that this is the opposite of sleeping in the dust, and then it's waking up. It's not they're asleep, but now we'll redefine life some other way to make it seem not so bad. No, it is the reversal of the death that they had experienced. They're asleep in the earth, dead, decomposed, and God says from the earth He will then raise them up. This is bodily resurrection that's being talked about. And then finally, let me just close this point, and I'll see what questions you have on this text. Notice that this promise of resurrection is the opposite fate of the pagans. Because remember in verse 14, God said of those pagan powers, they're dead. God's going to wipe them out. But the flip side of that is those that died in faith in God, His people, they will be raised from the dead. And then finally, let me get through these last points here quickly. This promise of resurrection is part of God's restoration of creation. So in other words, this resurrection of the dead is kind of one piece of the puzzle. It's part of God's whole restoration project for the things that are wrong in the world that He made. Notice in verse 20 and 21 what this restoration will consist of as Isaiah focuses on it. Come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until the fury has passed by. For behold, Yahweh is coming out from His place to punish the inhabitants of the earth for their iniquity, and the earth will disclose the blood shed on it and will no more cover its slain. In other words, this promise of bodily resurrection for God's people is part of God's justice that He's going to enforce in His world. He's going to step in and judge the rebellious human beings who have rebelled against Him and who have harmed His people. He's going to come in and judge them and avenge the blood that has been shed on the earth. I think in this context in particular, the focus is the saints of God who've been killed by the pagan powers who've been ruling over them. That will be explicit in Daniel, which we'll see in a moment, but I think that's what Isaiah is getting at here too. And then finally, one more point. Notice what this restoration project of God will also include in 27 verse 1. It includes the destruction of the great serpent. In that day, in that same day of judgment, when God comes to judge the inhabitants of the world, then in chapter 27 verse 1 we're told, in that day Yahweh with His hard and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent. Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and He will slay the dragon that is in the sea. God's restoration of creation will include the punishment and destruction of the ultimate agent of rebellion himself. This is one of the most explicit promises of resurrection in the Old Testament. What questions or thoughts do you have on Isaiah 26? Before we look at the second text, more briefly. But what questions or thoughts do you have on this passage, in Isaiah 26? Andrew? Yeah. Are we going to know that? Yeah. What's your thought on that? Yeah. In verse 14, when it says that God has wiped out all remembrance of them, being the evil pagan powers that, as of right now, have power. Andrew's asking, does that speak at all to the idea of, some people will ask, hey, if we're going to be resurrected, will we know each other? And does this speak to that? I guess my short answer would be, I don't think this speaks to that explicitly. I think what Isaiah just means here is that no matter how powerful the nations of the world seem now, they always fall and are destroyed, and they become nothingness to God. I don't think Isaiah is speaking here about that particular question. I think there are other texts in the New Testament that speak more directly to that. In fact, next week, when we look at the resurrection of Jesus in Luke's gospel, I'm going to address that specifically. This text, I just think he means that these powers that seem so powerful now, they don't last. They're not going to last, and no one ends up remembering them. I mean, and think about us. We live that today. As horrible as Rome was in the first century to Christians and subsequent centuries, today it's just a distant memory that almost means nothing to us. Now, to be fair, there's other people persecuting Christians in other parts of the world, but ultimately they won't last either. I think that's all Isaiah's getting at here. Yeah, Brother John? Yeah, Brother John just asked, in verses 20 and 21, is this a text that some people will refer to who believe in the millennium, the millennial reign of Christ? I don't know. I don't know if this is a text they would go to for that. I don't think this text is speaking to that. It's just, yeah. This imagery is common. In verses 20 and 21, when you read the prophets, this imagery is common where it just describes this day of the Lord, as it's so often called in the prophets. And what is that? What's this day of the Lord? Well, it's the day where God steps in conclusively into creation to punish sinners and vindicate the saints. And so then when it's described by the prophets, they'll describe it with this imagery of fleeing from the Lord's wrath and things like you see here in verses 20 and 21. And it's just describing that final day of judgment, which in the New Testament makes clear that it will be Christ himself who is the agent of that judgment, who brings that day of the Lord to bear on creation, where he will judge sinners and vindicate the saints. Yeah, Andrew? Yeah, well, in the year of our Lord. Yeah, AD means in the year of our Lord. Yeah. But it's not, yeah, but it doesn't mean the same thing. Yeah. Very good. Any other questions or thoughts on Isaiah 26? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Brother Jim looks like he's just chomping the bit. He's like, I got something, just gonna, but not this time. All right, well, let's look at the second text. We'll go through this one more briefly, and then I'll wrap up with two applications, and we'll be done. The second text that explicitly promises resurrection is in the book of Daniel, and probably Daniel is influenced by this Isaiah 26 text. Daniel lives after Isaiah, and the similar imagery between these two texts, I think it's probable that Daniel is just borrowing from Isaiah's imagery. He was influenced by Isaiah's prophecies and oracles. Now, we're not going to read the entire context here of Daniel like we did in Isaiah, but let me put this first point up here to just give you a summary of an important element that Daniel 11 describes. And it's this. Similar to, or I should say parallel to Isaiah 26, just before we get to our text, Daniel makes it clear that God's people will suffer under pagan overlords. And that's in Daniel 11, verses 29 to 39 in particular. We won't read that for time's sake. But that's the point that Daniel's making in those verses, is that there's going to come a time of hardship for God's people, where they are subjugated by pagan powers, and they're going to be persecuted and killed by these pagan powers. So it's in that context, then, that we come to Daniel 12, verses 1 through 3. Now let's read these 3 verses here, and then we'll discuss it. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Now in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, Daniel isn't describing the more immediate deliverance from the pagan powers that were described in chapter 11. Daniel skips ahead, or you could say God skips ahead, to the ultimate deliverance at the end of the age. Now you might be wondering, Nathan, how do you know that Daniel 12, 1 to 3 is talking about the final judgment and the final act of God at the end of the age? Well, because notice in verse 2, he says that those who sleep in the dust shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting contempt. So this is eternal here. So God is kind of skipping ahead and saying, the ultimate deliverance that I want you to have in your mind is that I will raise you from the dead, and you will be with me for eternity. Whereas the pagan powers, the rebels, will be judged for eternity. That's the ultimate deliverance that God wants them to focus on. And so that brings us then to the second point here. In verse 1, we're given the promise in Daniel 12, God will deliver those whose names are in the book of life. God will deliver those whose names are in the book of life. I've added the words of life. You know, in Daniel 12, verse 1, it just says whose names are written in the book. I think it's safe to say that's the book of life, which other biblical authors will use that expression. And then notice what form this deliverance takes. This deliverance that God promises is bodily resurrection, which he then describes in verse 2. Bodily resurrection will be the ultimate deliverance for God's people. And Daniel uses the same imagery from Isaiah 26. Those who sleep in the dust, what will happen to them? They will awake. They will awake. And it's a really important point, I think, to put this subpoint up here so that we understand this is one reason why the doctrine of bodily resurrection is so important. Because resurrection, as we see in this text as well as in Isaiah 26, this is God's recompense for the murder of his people by pagans. This is God's recompense. That is, it's his way of righting wrongs. When God's saints in the past and in the present have their lives taken by pagans, that is an egregious wrong. That is not as it should be. God has created us to live because life is a blessing. And when people who believe in the life giver are then murdered for their belief in the life giver, that is egregious. And God's way of righting that wrong, as we see in Daniel 12 and Isaiah 26, is they're not going to stay dead. I'm going to raise up their bodies that were so cruelly killed for faith in me. So that ultimately the saints of God, even if they are murdered for their faith, will ultimately lose nothing. They will gain. Whereas the pagan powers who thought they were the ones in control and who thought that God's people were weak, they will be the ones to then be raised up and face God in judgment. And that just leads to our next point here. Notice that resurrection will include everlasting judgment for the rebellious. Notice that in verse 2. Resurrection includes the raising up of rebels to be judged by God in the body. I spoke about this in our first class, and some of you asked questions about it, and I said, we're going to get to the text where I'm getting that from. This is one of them. And Jesus himself will then allude to this passage in John chapter 5, where Jesus will talk about the resurrection of life for the righteous and the resurrection of judgment for the rebellious. He's getting that right here from Daniel 12. So it's important for us to know that just as death is not the end for God's saints, death is also not an escape for the rebellious. They don't get away with it. They killed God's saints in their bodies. So they will be raised in their bodies to then face God in judgment for that cruelty. And then finally, the last point here. Notice that in verse 3, we're given the seeds that will then grow, as we'll see in 1 Corinthians 15 when we get to the text. The resurrected righteous will shine in glory. This future resurrection is not a mere resuscitation. It's not that God's going to raise me up, for example, as still a type 1 diabetic. I got my insulin pumped here. And so, I've been raised and I still have diabetes. Okay, thank you. That's great. I mean, I guess that would still be a blessing. I guess I shouldn't be ungrateful for that. It'd still be a blessing. But it's not that. We're not being raised up to then still have these imperfections in the body. Daniel makes it clear here that no, they're raised up in the body, yes, but it is a glorified existence. They will shine in God's new creation. And Paul will pick up this point and explain this to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15. And I've said this to you, some of you personally and in the class, there's continuity between our current bodies and our resurrection bodies, but there's also discontinuity between our current bodies and the resurrection body. And this text starts to give you those elements there. And then finally, I lied. There's one more point. We need to note this too, about this text in the context of Daniel's book. The resurrection deliverance is foreshadowed in the deliverances from death earlier in the book of Daniel. This promise of bodily resurrection does not come out of nowhere in Daniel's book. Daniel has been leading up to it the entire time in the deliverances from death earlier, when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are going to be murdered by a pagan in the fiery furnace, and God delivers them. God is pointing to his ultimate deliverance that he then just spells out in Daniel 12. When Daniel himself is thrown in the lion's den by a pagan, and God delivers him from death, that is pointing to, it's a foreshadowing of the ultimate deliverance from death that God then promises in Daniel 12. Daniel's book has been preparing for this up until Daniel 12. Now, for the sake of time, let me go ahead and just wrap up with our 2 applications so we can finish, and I'm sure some of you got some good family plans today for Easter. Let me wrap this up. But if you have any questions or thoughts, just come see me afterwards. Or you can email me. My email address is at the bottom of the book on the front cover, just so you know. So feel free to email me too, if there's something you want to discuss that you don't get a chance to. There are 2 applications that I want us to take from what we've seen in these 2 explicit Old Testament promises of resurrection. The first one, I think, is really important. Because like I said earlier, it helps us to understand why the doctrine of resurrection matters and why it is so problematic when we deny bodily resurrection for God's saints. Here it is. Resurrection is tied to God's commitment to justice for his people and judgment for rebels. Resurrection is tied to God's commitment to justice for his people and judgment for rebels. in the context of these two passages, Isaiah 26 and Daniel 12, resurrection is a specific way that God is going to right wrongs in His creation, as I mentioned earlier. It is a wrong for His people to have their bodily existence ended by pagans, by those that reject God. And resurrection is a specific way, not only for God to show His power over death, that He is the one who has power over the pagans, but it is also a way for God to explicitly vindicate these people who gave their lives for their faith in God. When He raises up the dead, all of the dead, those who are the goats, to use Jesus' imagery, on the left, the ones, though He says, "Depart from me, I never knew you," they will look out on the saints in their glorified bodies and they will know we were dead wrong. What have we done? And the saints who were tortured to death in many cases, the saints who've lost their lives and who never got to see God's promises come to fruition, they will see the new creation and they will be vindicated and glorified alongside the risen Christ. And I think because of the luxury and safety within which we practice our faith, it's just so easy for us to forget how important this point is. That so often throughout world history, God's people have been the ones persecuted, the ones not in power, the ones tortured to death and killed. In fact, I had to put this in your book. If you look on page 12, flip over to page 12. This is just fascinating to me, and it so well illustrates this point. Let's see, if I remember correctly, I don't remember if I put it in here. Okay, yeah, the 2nd century. All right, so in the late 2nd century, Christians in Gaul, France, were being persecuted by the Roman authorities. And I haven't put the whole text in here. Eusebius describes the tortures and horrible things they went through in their Colosseum in Gaul. And a picture of that is there at the bottom of your book on page 12. That is the Colosseum where the Christians were killed that Eusebius mentions. You can still see that Colosseum today. Now, just read with me on this 3rd paragraph and just think about the injustice of this, but how resurrection will bring justice to these murdered saints. Not even this, that is the torture and murder of the Christians, was enough to satisfy their, that is the pagans' maniacal cruelty. Goaded on by Satan in the context, they threw to the dogs those who had been strangled in jail, watching day and night that we did not tend to them. That is the fellow Christians. They couldn't go and bury the bodies and tend to the wounded. They were kept from doing that. Then the pagans, threw out the remains left by the beasts and the fire, torn and charred, while a military guard watched the heads and the trunks of the rest for many days, denying them burial. Some gnashed their teeth at them. Others laughed and jeered, glorifying their idols for punishing their foes. The more moderate, with little sympathy, taunted the Christians, "Where is their God? And what did they get out of their religion which they preferred to their own lives? We, however, greatly grieved at not being able to bury the bodies." And then look at this next paragraph. After they were exposed and insulted for 6 days, the martyrs' bodies were burned to ash and swept by the wicked into the Rhone River, which flows nearby, so that not even a trace of them would still appear on earth. They did this as if to conquer God and to defeat their rebirth, so that, as the pagans said, they might not have any hope of resurrection, because of which they have introduced a strange new cult, ignored torture, and gone joyfully to their death. Now let's see if they will rise again and if their God will save them. And one of the important things about the resurrection promise is that that is exactly what those pagans are going to see on the day of judgment. They will see those saints, as well as all of God's people, raised up from the dead, and they will know just how wrong they were. And they will be raised in the body to face God in judgment, who they mocked and whose power they mocked, just like Goliath did to the Israelites. This doctrine of resurrection is an important element of God's commitment in His creation to justice for His people and judgment for rebels. And then finally, last application here. This is a point I'm going to make multiple times in this class, but we should make it here. From these two texts, we see very clearly that God's plan is not to compromise with death, but to undo it by resurrecting the bodies death had claimed. God's plan in the Bible is not to say, hey, Satan, pagan powers, you killed my people, that's okay, you take the body, I'll take the soul. And there's this compromise here. That is not the biblical story. That's not a victory for God. God's plan is to resurrect His people. And in doing so, He will show Satan and sin and all the forces aligned with Satan, you never had power over my people. Never. They were always in my care, and here's the eternal evidence of that. There's a reason why, in the first century, bodily resurrection was a prominent view among Jews in the first century. Not universal. We know the Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection. I'll mention that a little bit later. But there's a reason why that this was prominent in first century Judaism. There's a reason why Martha says to Jesus, when Jesus says to her, your brother Lazarus will rise again, there's a reason why she says to Jesus, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Where did she get that from? She got it from these texts that we just looked at, and others like them, but we haven't looked at. But from texts like these, Isaiah 26, Daniel 12, they expected a resurrection at the end of the age, on the last day, because that's what God had promised He would do in Isaiah 26 and Daniel 12. What they were not expecting, though, what took them by surprise, took them a little while to internalize, was that that future resurrection would occur to a single individual in this age. That's not what they were expecting. And it is the resurrection of that single individual, Jesus of Nazareth, that we'll talk about next Sunday in our fourth lesson, and why His resurrection is so important for this doctrine. With that, thank you for your kind attention today. God be with you this week, and happy Easter to you.